All right, so welcome. I'm very, very happy to have a chance to be here. Now, let's get ourselves in the mood. I'm going to talk about pain and suffering today. I hope I don't cause you too much of that, but we will see about that, by the way. So this is a famous painting by Bruegel's Triumph of Death. Some of you may know it. If I talk about every single painting I show, we'll be here for 3 hours, so I won't do that. But I just want to point out some very, very important matters here. So Bruegel did this painting in 1562. It was about in response to the wave of plagues that were ravaging Europe. But also the religious wars. Catholics were killing Protestants, Protestants were killing Catholics. It was a time of incredible pain and suffering. In fact, I want to talk about this a little bit later in the talk today, but as Foucault points out in Discipline and Punishment, the punishments were public then, whereas the punishments today are often, people are locked away and being punished. But one of the really striking things here is just like on the right side is an army of pretty much skeletons walking forward, holding a cross. There were people being grabbed at a table who are there, they're in the midst of playing cards. One thing that really interests me, and again, a lot of people, even people who know something about the period, don't really kind of think enough about, in my opinion, is the way that people were executed in the period. If you were even just caught like stealing something, you were executed by being put on a wheel, and that meant your arms and legs were broken. As your body was put on the wheel, you were out in the air like this, obviously in huge and terrible pain. It could take days to die. Birds would pluck out your eyes. Insects would eat your flesh. If your screams bothered the people in your family, it was too bad. Everyone had to listen to you scream. Are we having fun yet? All right. Now here's a detail from this painting. But again, I hope not to cause you too much pain today, but one of my interests in this project and one of my interests in my life in general is ideas about pain and suffering. I'm quite interested as a philosopher. This is partly due to my work in prison and my commitment to what my activist friends called the transformation, or transcending rather, of the punishment paradigm. But I'm interested in how we human beings think and respond to our own suffering, how we think or ignore the suffering of others, even the suffering that we cause others, and how we respond to the suffering of others, or in fact ignore it. Now, a few years ago, I was getting involved in this anti-carceral activism, but I realized in my day job as a historian of philosophy that no one had thought seriously at all about the history of the notion of suffering and its relation to philosophy. So this project of mine, Feeling the Way to Truth, Women, Reason, and the Development of Modern Philosophy, grew out of that set of thoughts. Now, basically, one of the things I want to do is I think that we need to do a complete reconsideration of the history of philosophy, especially the development of early modern philosophy as it's told. And I think in this audience, not a lot of people probably know or remember the details of the development of modern philosophy and the story about that. So let me remind you. Now, this is a parody. It's called The Myth of such and such. But as a parody, it would be only funny except for the fact that it still remains pretty true. So this is the parody, and I hope you think it's as amusing as I do, but never mind. I wish I had a Judi Dench kind of voice here. It came to pass that the earth was without form and void, and darkness covered the face of the earth. And the Creator saw that the darkness was evil, and he spoke out in the darkness, saying, "Let there be light." And there was light, and he called the light Renaissance. And thus it was that the continental rationalists came to be. So Descartes begat Spinoza, and Spinoza begat Leibniz. And thus it was that the British empiricists came to be. So that Hobbes begat Locke, and Locke begat Berkeley, and Berkeley begat Hume. And then it was that there arose the great sage of Königsberg, the great Immanuel Kant, who, though neither empiricist nor rationalist, was likened to both. He it was who combined the eye of the scientist with the mind of the mathematician. And this too the Creator saw, and saw that it was good. And he sent goodly men and scholars true to tell the story, wherever men should henceforth gather to speak of sages past. Now, this was written in 1981, just at the moment when people are reconsidering this narrative, but it still is strikingly embraced by many people in many departments. This is the kind of history of philosophy that's typically told. And if you doubt that, I just point out that, for example, the book on the right here, the Norton Introduction to Philosophy, was supposed to be the great new introduction to philosophy. It's edited by very, very serious philosophers. In fact, one of them is a friend of mine. They talked to a lot of people about what kind of introduction to philosophy they needed. It was published 3 years ago. And it contains 1,168 pages. It starts with Aristotle and Plato on main topics in the history of philosophy and works through those topics. So it covers 2,400 years of philosophy. But nowhere in any of its pages is there a mention of a person who wrote in Arabic or a Jewish thinker. Not a single woman author until the mid-20th century. It entirely ignores anyone except the canonical figures. So it also, by the way, talks about political philosophy and the development of political philosophy, and does not mention, as most people don't, the very important 19th century authors who were former slaves in the United States, who had many really interesting things to say, but again, whose voices have not been heard. Now, it's a really good question, I think, and I think, for you folks, like, how did this come to pass? How did this story get to be told? By the way, these two other books are standard collections as well, same thing, not a single woman. A friend of mine and I did an op-ed in the Washington Post, which really kind of, got their blood circulating, and everyone now is going to include a woman in the next edition or two of these books. All right, so how did the story get set? Well, in a way, it's surprisingly easy. Post-Kantian German philosophers created a narrative about the history of philosophy that highlighted what they considered to be the most important philosophical questions. That is, they told a story that conveniently led to themselves as the heroes. In his 1820 lectures on the history of philosophy, Hegel credits Descartes with breaking wholly with the past and setting the stage for the greatness of his own philosophy, writing, this is astonishing, he writes, Germanic philosophy, i.e. modern philosophy, begins with Descartes. And in his lectures in 1820s, 1847 rather, Schopenhauer also insists that our excellent Descartes is the instigator of the subjective investigation, and in this, the father of modern philosophy. So Hegel and then Schopenhauer after him kind of told the story about how Descartes started something that ended with them. Now, Kuno Fischer, you probably haven't heard of. It was an extremely popular lecturer and philosopher in Germany. He was in Heidelberg, wrote several volumes, including this is a multi-volume edition of the history of philosophy. It's actually really pretty good. No wonder he was considered a good teacher. It tells this big, grand story. But according to him, Descartes made a fundamental and complete renovation of philosophy. It's actually, at points, unintentionally hilarious. He compares Descartes to Faust in Goethe's Faust, who goes off into the world and and wants to discover nature as opposed to read books. Now, it strikes me this is not that's not that complimentary to Descartes, but never mind. All right, now also, the story gets going by these German thinkers in late 19th century, and then it's picked up by very, very serious and again, very well-educated and thoughtful philosophers in France and Germany. I'll just mention Ernst Cassirer here because he really was a very, very fine philosopher. Ignore the German, I was going to translate it, but you can basically get the point. The basic point is that the 17th century philosophy, and you can see underlined here systems, he wants to see 17th century philosophy as a series of systems. He mentions here, He mentions here Descartes, Malebranche, Spinoza, Leibniz, Bacon, and Hobbes, and so on. So again, it's a story of philosophy. It's a series of beads on a string, all of which are great systems. I think I underlined the bit that says system. So he's interested in the history of philosophy was set then as a series of systems. Now, you can imagine that with this story told for over 150 years, this is what philosophers taught, this is what philosophers did. It's really hard to shake this loose, right? But a lot of us these days, I'm not by no means the only one, in fact, by no means the first one, are trying to kind of think about how to diversify philosophy. There's a number of websites, there's a lot of good work being done. This is just a website for a center I started. It has my 3 passions, including rethinking justice. I'd love to tell you about Aisha Elliott. She's one of my best friends. She was incarcerated for 25 years, but never mind about that. She's great. But I think I mentioned to my Radcliffe colleagues last week about the Oxford Philosophical Concepts, and Meredith mentioned that. But here are some of the first volumes still out. What I didn't mention, by the way, is that the new volume that's coming out is going to be the longest of all of them yet, and that's the one on evil, which I think is appropriate, possibly. Now, the new Oxford Histories of Philosophy are, again, attempting to get very serious scholars to do editions of books that have not been available. The first book in the series is on Mexican philosophy, as Meredith mentioned. One of the next ones coming along is on Martin Delaney, the man whose photograph is at the top. He's a black nationalist writing in the mid-19th century, considered to be really brilliant political theorist. The Principia Philosophia is the title of a book by Anne Conway, the philosopher I'm working on. Some of us are also doing a new translation and edition of her work. So there's a lot of work coming along the way. Now, back to my project. So one of the things I hope I will be able to do in my project is to shake some things loose, especially shake loose the relationship between early modern philosophy and Descartes in late medieval philosophy, and also this nonsense that Descartes created the subjective turn. So one of the things I really hope to do is to, by killing these sacred cows, that, for example, the sacred cow of Descartes inventing the subjective turn, and the fact and the idea that actually one thing that interests me I haven't mentioned yet is that we're supposed to believe that the Enlightenment thinkers like Locke and Rousseau and so on invented the notion of equality and dignity and so on. In my opinion, it's quite clear that these late medieval women I've been working on, it's all there. The roots of those ideas are embedded very deeply into late medieval thought. Now, obviously, I can't tell this whole story today, but I want to focus just on one part of it, the part I thought you might find most interesting, namely the bit on suffering, and particularly the relationship between suffering and virtue. Okay, suffering's deep background. Now I picked this is Zeus. He's a very manly man, and so I thought it would be good to use him as an example of an ancient notion of virtue. The Latin virtus, the original sense means strength. It means power. In fact, in 17th century philosophy, for a very long time, virtus was used to talk about force. It was a word that was used to think about physics. It came to be obviously primarily related to being virtuous as we think of it now, but it's important to realize that this notion of strength was basic. Okay, now one of the obsessions of ancient philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, and so on, was the idea of how to live a proper life, how to live a virtuous life. In short, how to get life right. So Plato, for example, says, so long as we keep to the body, there is no chance of our ever attaining truth, because the body fills us with loves and desires and passions of all sorts, so that we never get an opportunity to think about anything at all. Now, this is the Phaedo, where Plato is particularly anti-body. It's less clear in some other dialogues, but still, this is the one that kind of was set and very influential. So let's just be clear about what Plato is saying. He's saying that reason, understanding it's sometimes translated as, has to deny the body. You cannot be tainted by corporeal matters if you're going to attain to and actually focus on eternal truths, right? So the only way to get things right is to deny the body, to have strength to overcome the body. So if you attend to the body, then it follows that you can't have virtue. You can't get things right. Your life is going to suck, in short. Now, interesting in ancient literature, there's lots of options for women, and women can be agents. They're goddesses. Medea is a demigod. She kills her children before taken up to heaven. Why is she taken up to heaven despite the fact that she's killed her children? Because she's heroic. She's defended her honor. By the way, Toni Morrison was quite interested and influenced by her in writing Beloved. All right. But by the time we get to early Christian, actually, let me skip back here for a second and just tell you, but already at this point, already in ancient literature, there is this tendency to think of women as not as fully capable of being rational, as fully capable as being powerful. There are powerful women, but it's still a problem to attain virtue. Now, let's look at some of the reasons for that. According to Aristotle, the female is, as it were, a deformed male. According to the best medical doctors in the period, medical philosophers, because the female body has an imbalance of fluids proven by the need to shed blood monthly, it is incomplete. Galen, writing 600 years later, one of the most important medical philosophy thinkers in medieval Europe, puts it very clearly. We shall look upon the female state as being a deformity, the one which occurs in the ordinary course of nature. Just as mankind is the most perfect of all animals, so within mankind, the man is more perfect than the woman. In response to an obvious question he's asked, why would the Creator purposely make half the human race imperfect and, as it were, mutilated? The answer he gives, he made man complete and woman incomplete so that she could be made complete through bearing children. And Clement of Alexandria, a very important thinker, and again, there's hundreds of examples of this kind of thing, puts it very succinctly. I really like this way of putting it as a way of summarizing the view. To do, to act, to be an agent, to be virtuous is the mark of a man. To suffer is the mark of a woman. And one of the things I want to point out here is just how fluids play an important role for these medical scientists. Okay, now, don't have time to go into it, but one of the things that we really need to remember is in early Christianity, there were radical different ways of being a Christian. There are ways that lots of women were actually out there reading and writing. Eileen Pagels talks about this. There were lots of different versions of being a Christian, including some that actually, believe it or not, read Genesis as having Eve be the good guy, so to speak. Talk about that later with people if they're interested, but it was a common reading of Genesis. So there are many different versions of early Christianity, and I think, I would remind you that there's two creation stories in Genesis. One has Adam and Eve being created at the same time. It's the second creation story, inconsistent clearly with the first, where Eve is taken from the rib of Adam. Now that in itself is the one that got set. Okay, so Augustine. By the 4th century BC, the fate of women for medieval Europe was sealed. This was mostly thanks to the brilliant, no denying, brilliant, prolific, and utterly mean-spirited person, Augustine of Hippo. The reading of the Genesis and the Gospels that Augustine helped codify made it clear that women were physically and morally inferior to men. The arguments for these claims were straightforward enough. Eve's morality and her moral inferiority follow from the fact that she was created second and sinned first. Now notice the image on the right. She comes out of Adam's Eve, and within almost the same temporal frame, right, is already starting to sin. But also Eve's physical inferiority, which is closely related to her moral inferiority, was to make her morally perverse. So let's think about that a little bit more. So the punishment that God gave Eve involved her fertility, and in that sense her body, which was supposed to lie at the core of her nature. And given her inferiority, she clearly needed ruling over. As we see in Genesis, to the woman, he said, I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth. In pain you will bring forth children. Yet, and I underline, your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. Now, again, if we had more time to talk, it'd be very interesting to talk about the utter kind of horror of this. Eve's nature is to desire her husband, but by following her nature, she's forced to suffer in childbirth and take on, as it were, the inferiority of her female form. So women, after the fall, are perverse. Their nature is perverse. For our purposes, it's important that the punishment of women is to be more rooted in their bodies, to be more inclined to desire and to suffer. It followed, of course, that they had no capacity for virtue, at least not by themselves. And again, you know these passages, I'll only read a couple. Women should remain silent in churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission. Notice, as the law says. Corinthians, women should remain silent. Corinthians 11:2-9. For I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, and the husband is the head of his wife. For a man ought not to have his head veiled, since he is the image and reflection of God. But woman is a reflection of man. Indeed, man was not made for woman, but woman for man, and so on. Again, the same idea that you find in Aristotle, which is woman is a deformed man. Okay, nor did Augustine's he pretty much single-handedly, in my opinion, gave us this mean-spirited, misogynistic version of Christianity. But he also, of course, was a beautiful, wonderful writer. In his Confessions, written at the end of the 4th century, set the stage for all of medieval Europe's kind of spiritual ways of thinking about spirituality. In fact, some scholars maintain that it's in Augustine we find the first subjective turn, arguably whether it's like Descartes, but still there. Now, so for much of medieval Europe then, these spiritual meditations, the sort that Augustine set up, were the way in which one meditated. Now, I don't want to go into the details. This is like a part of the philosophy of it all. But one of the things that the assumption here, and one of the really important points that underlies a lot of this, is that in order to attain virtue or to get life right, we must explore ourselves. This is for Augustine, explore ourselves and our beliefs. And this exploration requires, in fact, it's a whole long list of things. These are some of the more important ones. So after Augustine persuasively argued that women were not capable of doing this sort of thing, they didn't. They may have tried to do it. They may have actually written lots of things, but we have no evidence that they did. None of these materials, if they tried to write or did write, have survived. Okay, but, and this is where I get really excited, and this is sort of the beginning of my own new work, is that something really odd happened in the 12th century, actually between the 12th and 14th centuries. Women began to write and even to teach. You can tell they did because prominent men started protesting. The Chancellor of the University of Paris writes, the female sex is forbidden to teach in public. All women's teachings, particularly formal teaching by form, by word, and by writing, is to be held suspect unless it has been diligently examined and much more fully than men's. The reason is clear. Following Eve's legacy, women are easily seduced and determined seducers, and because it is not proved that they are witnesses to divine grace. This last bit is really insulting, right? Okay, so how could this problem arise? How could it arise that women were suddenly in a position to be writing things and be taken seriously, and be taken so seriously that the chancellor of the bloody University of Paris has to complain about it? There was, in short, a radical shift in religious modes. Beginning in the 12th century and developing steadily over the next few, there was what's called a new genre of spiritual meditative exercises with the express goal of teaching readers how to identify with the suffering of Christ. The shift in religious practices, and it was radical, is what scholars call affective meditations. This is what one scholar writes about this. The meditations ask their readers to imagine themselves present at the scenes of Christ's suffering and to perform compassion for that suffering victim in a private drama of the heart. These were crafted to teach their readers, through iterative effective performance, how to feel. So, so I think it's clear, these images are really incredible. This image is, in fact, this is a book by a professor here at Harvard, Jeffrey Hamburger, who discovered this cachet of art by women in a monastery, and really basically painting about their religious and spiritual lives. Notice the blood. Notice the kind of blood and guts, so to speak, of this image on the left. On the right is an image from the early 16th century, but you see suddenly, and this has not been true before around 1100, Christ is represented as a suffering entity. He's not the king of heaven anymore with the crown on, who's kind of like, this is my imitation of the Christ before us, like la-di-da, if you know the end of Monty Python and the Holy Grail. But he is a passionate human being who has suffered for the sake of humanity. This is an example of just like one of hundreds of examples, but not only did women write, women told people to make books for them. This is Mary going, and this is made by, in fact, a friend of mine is working on this. This is meditations that were written for the Poor Clares, the female version of the St. Francis women, so to speak, after Clare, his friend. And they asked that a meditation be written showing Mary going out and preaching and giving money and so on and aid to the poor. I made the mistake of not copying a folio, which is really wonderful. In this same volume, there is actually a drawing of Christ, of Jesus kind of sitting at the table, and Mary's washing dishes. She's made dinner for him. There's one of my favorite people that I'm working on and just discovered in the past few years is this wonderful person, Julian of Norwich. And I show this because she was what's called an anchoress. Many women in this period would anchor themselves, would enclose themselves in a small part of a church. They basically lived in this room. But they also, many of them had little windows and would actually be spiritual advisors to people. In fact, a couple of these women became famous as kind of the therapist, the shrinks for the town. People would come up and talk to them about their husband or problem child. But notice what Julian says. Just because I am a woman, must I therefore believe that I must not tell you about the goodness of God when I saw his wish that it should be known. So this is the argument. God was showing them truths, and it was their obligation to share the truths that God was showing them. And how was God showing them these truths? God was showing them these truths by their capacity to identify with the suffering of Jesus, the suffering of Mary, the suffering of other people, so they could actually take on the insights of these spiritual beings. Notice what she says, and this is common. I wanted to suffer with him and with others who loved him, and I wanted his pains to be my pains with compassion. So one of the things that was really striking to me when I first understood this is compassio, to suffer with, was invented in this period. The notion of compassion was not a notion that was prominent and current. So suddenly the idea, the goal to be compassionate, to suffer with people becomes prominent. Now again, if I talked about all the art and images, I'd be here too long, and I may be here too long anyway. In fact, somebody's going to have to tell me about the time. But this piétal is one of the most striking objects I've ever seen. One of the things I learned is that pietas, who knew, I didn't, that didn't exist until 1300. And they began, probably the first pietas were created by women in the Rhineland of Germany. It was a function of kind of women wanting to, in a way, see themselves in God. And what's striking to me about this work, in my a little art class sometimes I teach at Columbia, art appreciation really, what's striking to me about this is the focus is not on Jesus. Jesus is dead. Sure, he suffered. But the focus is on Mary and at the kind of moment of her loss and the horror of the recognition of her misery. So we see him through her, but she is the primary conduit of our suffering. We compassio, we are compassionate with her. Now, one of the striking things that these women did, and actually Carolyn Bynum first wrote about this. She has this beautiful book called Jesus as Mother. And I remember reading that title and thinking, like, this is too weird for words. But basically, what these women were particularly inclined to do, and men did too, in fact, this tradition began in monasteries by men, is to think of Jesus as a mother who suckled the breast of his children. And the head of monasteries saw themselves in the same way. It's kind of transgender, goodness knows what. Now, this is a book from 1616 I found, searching around. And look at the top. This is by the Jesuits. This is probably, I can't remember actually the details now. This is probably Ignatius. And what's he doing? He's lactating. You see his breast? And actually, it's very interesting how he is kind of female. Right? You don't see, there's no indication of a penis. So he is lactating, sending his milk out so that his children might suckle and follow him. It's pretty wild stuff. Okay, so let's rethink then the meditative spiritual exercises. Everything we said before is still true, but we have this new requirement. The virtue seeker now must analyze, categorize, and understand her feelings. That's what these effective meditations are about. They're to teach you how to feel in the right way. They're to teach you, first you're sympathetic, but then you have to become more so. You have to focus so much on the suffering of the people who have suffered for you that you actually sometimes bleed yourself. In fact, you know, people know about St. Francis's stigmata. Women had had them for a century before St. Francis got them. They would suddenly, spontaneously bleed, as it were. So you had to, the truth seeker had to analyze, categorize, and understand her feelings. They had to suffer with Jesus and other religious figures. And the meditator, in short, had to feel their way to virtue. Suddenly, the feeling was primary and important. Again, from Julian, for if I look solely at myself, I am really nothing. But as one of humankind in general, I am oneness of love with all others. For upon this oneness of love depends the life of all. For God is all that is good, and God has made all that is made, and God loves all that he has made. Here are some other passages I can have you kind of look at as you're going along here. I want to, though, talk a little bit about how kind of astonishing this is. So what do we have here? In the past, in the ancient notion of women and women's bodies, to suffer, to be related to your body, to have affect, was to guarantee that you couldn't find virtue. And now suddenly that's been turned on its head. And historians of the period talk a lot about why this happened. There's sort of, you can do a kind of good Marxist historical reading of this. Enormous suffering, suddenly actually, long story about that. But so there are social and economic reasons for this, surely. But the fact is that there was this effective radical transition, this change. Where the capacity, so that having a capacity to think through your feelings, to analyze your feelings, to worry about your feelings, was itself the means to think about and understand fundamental truths about the world. right? So suddenly, reason is important. It's not as if reason doesn't come into play. You have to think through arguments sometimes, and at the end, for some of these meditations, you actually do have to kind of think through and reason about the nature of God. So theology still plays a role, but you have this punctuated, so it's philosophy and reason, as it were, punctuated by an analysis of feeling. In fact, there was, and during the troubadours, the kind of love poetry that was written in the so-called 12th century Renaissance, many people, there's actually some very interesting cases where people say, I felt in all of these complicated and conflicting ways, but couldn't understand my feelings. And within a 20 or 30 year period, people are thinking about naming feelings, naming emotions, naming affects. And women have a very important role to play in that. So let's just focus a little bit on what Julian says here. God shows her all that is made. Now, this is philosophy. This is metaphysics. God is letting her know something about the nature of reality. Also notice that in fact, people talk about Julian in this way, and it's fascinating. What she's doing is, as it were, reading her body. She suffers for the suffering of other people. She thinks about suffering as something that she does and she thinks other people do. So there's a way in which she's reading her body, and from that, and she says here, and when the bodily vision stopped, the spiritual vision remained in my understanding. So it's not just about the body, it's about the body and the possibility for the body and the truths that it comes to in thinking about feelings and so on, to produce ideas that the understanding can embrace. Her insights, she says, are universal and addressed, notice, to all, because we are all one. Again, I can't focus on this too much here, but she says this, and this woman, the 17th century woman philosopher Anne Conway I'm working on. These women, especially Conway, it's clear that all human beings are capable of dignity. You don't have to be a Christian to come to truth. She says the Jews, Turks, that is, the Muslims and Christians can all understand what's true about the world. I mean, she's devoted and committed to an idea that all human beings are capable of loving one another. And then finally, Julian, if I look solely at myself, I am really nothing, but as one of humankind in general, I am openness of love with all others, and so on. Okay. But there are some who disagreed. And Aquinas, for example, it's very interesting. There's a whole discussion in Aquinas and Scotus based on the quotation from Psalm, the just man will rejoice when he sees divine vengeance. And I threw this in, but Aquinas is clear about the fact that when the blessed are in heaven, so you're lucky enough to get to heaven, one of the joys you feel in heaven is hearing the screams of the people in hell. They do rejoice in the suffering of the damned as a manifestation of divine justice. So not everyone agreed with Compasio. Okay, so the metaphysics of love. I haven't decided what to call this. My students want me to call it the metaphysics of love. It sounds a little bit too 1960s to me, but maybe I'll go with that. I can hear from people later on. But it's surely a metaphysics of affect. So one of the major parts of my book, and I'm not going to talk about this any more than I have today, is to talk about the metaphysics that these people are committed to, of an underlying vital divine force that all human beings have, that suffering produces an analysis of one's feelings and one's, as it were, love for other human beings. God has made the world so that all human beings stand in sympathetic harmony to one another. And if you understand that, then you've understood something fundamental about God and about the nature of the world. This mosaic from the 12th century in Rome is a really nice example of this interconnection of things. Okay, now in closing, I want to make 2 points. One is I have a bit of a problem. If I want to kind of rethink and rewrite the history of philosophy, which I do, I think, very easily show that these women had a major force and played a major role in the influence and the development of ideas, no problem. The problem is the way they wrote. So this is from Marie de Gournay, very famous in her time, feminist. She was a skeptic, really out there radical, much hated. She was kind of trolled in the early 17th century. Blessed are you, reader, if you do not belong to the sex of those who are deprived of proper education, so that ignorance, slavery, and the capacity to play the fool are established as woman's only happiness. Now, I'm really taken by this because one of the problems with Julian and Teresa of Avila, somebody else I work on, did I mention them before? Yeah, here are the three people, here are the other people I'm going to work on in the book. There might be somebody else involved. But all of these women are very, except for Anne Conway, who's writing in the 17th century, are very inclined to say, I'm just a woman, and what do I know? But here and then they zap you with some interesting insight. But what worries me is the fact that their writings then are not as sort of philosophically straightforward. They practice a genre that lots of philosophers and people who think about philosophy seriously don't kind of appreciate very much. But let me tell you in a couple minutes about some work I've done. I've already written about this, but again about Descartes. Now, when we think about Descartes, we think about that, he's supposed to have invented the self-reflecting individual, right? And that happens, the so-called Cogito Argument, I think I am, I think therefore I am in the discourse, it's I think I am, comma, I am in the meditations. But this begins with the evil deceiver argument. And everyone who's looked around for the source of Descartes' meditations have been stunned and amazed that there seems to be no sources for this, right? They've looked at Ignatius because Descartes was educated in a Jesuit school. In Ignatius, they all did spiritual meditations, and there's nothing in the spiritual exercises that Ignatius Loyola wrote that are anything like Descartes' meditations. So they looked around for a great man as the source, but nobody looked around for a great woman. In some of the major arguments in Descartes' meditations, I have a paper on this, are all in Teresa. And moreover, Teresa was a rock star, right? Everyone knew her. The Jesuits loved her. Now, I can't go into the details, but here's an account of the deceived. This is many books were written about her. Many books were summarizing her spiritual meditations. But just like Descartes' meditations, she thinks that she's making some headway towards the truth, and then the devil comes out and goes, boogie, boogie, boogie. Let me take your attention off your meditative exercises. And then look what she does. Like Descartes' meditator, she finally decides to analyze herself and her subjective truths in the right kind of way. And the poor dejected devils have to leave. I kind of even feel sorry for this first devil here. Now, Beyonce. You can't have a lecture about divinity without including Beyonce. So why Beyonce? Because Teresa was the Beyonce of the 17th century. You might not like her, but you could not ignore her, and you had to admire her. And I say that because, her books, all of her writings, originally in Spanish, were translated into Latin and were spread all over Europe. Here's someone, again, I don't have time to read all this stuff, but here's someone who says, the elements of the most profound philosophy are explained in your text. But here, and this is part of my problem now, because she was so damn clear at times, because she was so damn moving at times, many people thought that she must be in league with the devil. So it was her clarity that actually, when the clarity that was in her work got her in trouble in a way. And people complained about that. So one of the reasons, when she kept writing, one of the reasons she became a little bit less clear in cases, I think, is because she had to kind of be a little bit more meandering, in order to kind of accommodate these problems. Just to make clear how incredibly famous she was, this is one of the many English translations of her work. And I just want to point out this incredible little bit here that I found in the Folger Library. It presently appeareth a new wonder that a weak woman should be so courageous as to undertake so great an essay, and so wise and of such efficacy that she should bring it to pass and rob the hearts of those who treated with her, and so on. Now notice that there's always how smart she is, how awesome she is, how clear-headed she is, but also how she wins the hearts, because she does that with her sort of constant, very, very touching personal touches. So she was this great woman writing books, but she also had to present her philosophy, think about her philosophy in a gendered way so that it be taken seriously. So my question then, and something I really look forward to talking to people about over the year, is sort of how to think about the non-philosophical ways in which some of these texts, though richly philosophical, should be thought about. Now, in conclusion, and I have a conclusion and then a coda. And my conclusion is just that obviously, I hope I've convinced you by just a little bit I've said, that obviously the standard narrative of the development of early modern philosophy has to be rethought. The subjective turn happened earlier. Many of the features that we attribute to Enlightenment thinkers, which I can barely even talk about today, are extant throughout this period. I have lots of questions to my colleagues, and I really look forward to talking to you about how best to treat this material going ahead. But I want to end my lecture, because this is my tendency these days, with something that we should be thinking about, the pain and suffering now. Now, we can look at Bruegel's Triumph of Death, and we can sort of think about how we kind of confront and don't confront suffering in life, right? And so one of the things I want to make very clear is something that is that there's so much pain and suffering around us that we actually sometimes don't have the opportunity to think as much about compassio as these late medieval women did. These late medieval women were focused on how we think about ourselves in relation to the world. So just a couple quick little facts. One to do with Harvard. I wrote an op-ed 3 years ago because I was there had been a big push at Columbia to divest from the private prison industry. Now, if you don't know, the private prisons run almost all of the detention centers. So the poor immigrants that we worry a lot about, we worry and gnash our teeth about the fact that the children are being ripped from their mothers and fathers and so on and so forth. We really care about that. But how many people know that most of them are sent off to private prisons? They're private. The whole point is for them to make money, and they make millions of dollars. The CEO of Core Civic, what a lovely name for it, makes something like $5 million a year, okay? Now, this is a fact that we might think, well, okay, there's lots of really bad stuff that happens, what can we do about it? But the fact is, Harvard University, for example, still invest in the private prison industry. In fact, Harvard, part of the point of my op-ed is I pick out Harvard because it has such a bad history. Harvard didn't even divest from South Africa during the apartheid period, right? And it won't even consider divesting from the private prison industry. So when you're not sleeping at night because you can't bear the thought of these poor children being ripped from their mother or father, realize that your salary, if you're at Harvard, or this nifty podium here, is partly paid for on the backs of these children. Whoa, this is heavy. And then for those of you who are not Harvard, and are not at Harvard, you don't escape my wrath either. Just 3.5 miles from where I'm standing now is the Suffolk County Jail, which houses, it's really hard to get information about some of these places, 775 people who are there. Now, let's just think about what jails are like. And again, a lot of people don't confront this as much as I think they should. About probably 2/3 of the people in that jail are there because they can't pay bail. So the same person who did the same crime, who has money to pay bail, gets to sit at home waiting for his or her crime. But the people in Suffolk County who are there, who can't pay bail, are being abused, right? In fact, a lot of the more vulnerable of the people are being put in solitary confinement. And one of the things I learned is that Massachusetts, so you can think that you're from Massachusetts, it's a pretty liberal, progressive state. It's not good on solitary confinement, and there's no movement to change the bail system. Now, some of you may know this incredible story about Kalief Browder, and this is my last little slap in the face. You know, this is in the New Yorker, but here's this young man who turned out to be innocent, but was arrested for basically looking black and having a backpack. Was thrown in jail, his case was a mess. He was put in solitary confinement because he was so vulnerable. He was in that solitary confinement for over 2 years. When he finally gets out, he's basically lost his mind. And I think 3 years later, he's committed suicide, right? So I just want to make clear, this is the Foucaultian point that I made earlier. When we think about the suffering in 16th and 17th century Europe and the suffering that these women had to face in their own lives in late medieval Europe, much of that suffering was kind of present and real. Whereas we conveniently throw our suffering into boxes far away that we can't see. So I said that I wasn't going to call this pain and suffering, and I have, I hope, a little bit. But anyway, I also hope I've enlightened you a little bit about the need to rethink suffering in life, and in particular, in the history of philosophy. Thank you.